Well, thank you, Bridget, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Shelley and Yanka and everyone else who has helped put this program together. Antonio and I are honored to be here tonight and have a chance to talk about our work. I will start things off by talking about the projects at Martha Washington, and Antonio will come up a bit later and talk about the work of the Beacon Food Forest. Let's start by talking about the oaks in Seattle. Let's see if I can make this thing work here. This map up here shows the concentration of historic Garry oaks in southeast Seattle. And by a historic Garry oak, I mean a fairly good-sized tree that nobody remembers planting. Because a lot of trees have been planted at Seward Park and Martha Washington Park, but these trees have been there for a long time. Some of them have been there for around 200 years, but most of them are in the age range of about 100 years old. Up here at Seward, I get this thing pointed, there's probably the largest number of oaks. At Martha Washington Park, we did have 9, but now we have 8 major oak trees. One of them fell this year, and then there's a few scattered around in the neighborhood. This area had several longhouses. In fact, there were longhouses all around Lake Washington. And all over the Pacific Northwest, the first peoples regularly started fires to keep conifers from encroaching on prairies and oak woodlands. Without those fires, there's no question that those oak woodlands would not exist today. So I think of these oaks as something to treasure and as a monument to the ancestors of the Duwamish people. If anybody has any doubts about what happens to an oak that's surrounded by conifers, this picture should set it to rest. The oak on the left is in an area at Seward Park on the south shore, which is mowed. The tree has full capability of growing. There's nothing in its way. It's made that beautiful mushroom shape that oaks make. It's extremely healthy. It's close to 200 years old. The oak on the right here, you can see the top of the tree. These are the only branches on it that are left alive. The rest of them are dead. There are conifers all around it that shade it. It's not clear how much longer that oak is going to last, maybe 10, 20 years before it finally dies. Now, most of the oaks at Seward are somewhere between those two. These are the extreme ends of the range at Seward. The next question is, what was the original? I'm going to turn this thing over here so I can see that. Oh, that's much better. Okay. What was the original ecosystem like at Martha Washington Park? Well, at both Martha Washington Park and Seward Park, it was an oak madrone woodland, which is a well-documented ecotype in the state of Washington. In fact, you can still see madrone trees. There's about, I don't know, close to 100 of them at Seward Park. There are more oak trees there than there are, more madrone trees than there are oak trees at Seward. But at Martha Washington, we still have a few. These 2 madrones still exist at Martha Washington Park. This madrone right here is the Smith madrone, which you can see over here. The Smith madrone fell around 1990. And to give you an idea of the size of the tree, there's a picture of a person standing next to it. So the base of this tree had a diameter greater than 6 feet. In fact, Smith, who owned the area, built a staircase for children to climb the tree and get up into it. This is a well-documented ecotype in Washington, and it had a fire frequency somewhere between 5 and 25 years, which means that at least every 25 years, someone would start a fire in there. Okay, otherwise, if you didn't do that, the conifers would overtake the madrones and the oaks. But if you started the fire more often than 5 years, then what would happen is you'd kill off the madrones. The madrones are fire dependent and fire sensitive. If you don't burn, you get conifers. If you burn too often, then the madrones cannot regenerate from their base. So that's why the fire frequency is a little bit longer than it would be on a prairie. But that is short enough to support either a shrub understory or like berries, berry plants, or a graminoid bulb forb kind of understory that's more like a prairie. We have planted both at Martha Washington Park under the oaks. But tonight I'm going to talk about the bulb graminoid forb understory because that's really the most interesting one. And because that's a mouthful, I will usually just say understory, or I'll use the word meadow, which is absolutely incorrect, but it carries the connotation that people want. Our first decision was what kind of a restoration program would we have? And there are kind of 2 major types of restoration that are done in the world. There's a wonderful book called Ecological Restoration and Environmental Change by Stuart Allison. And he reviews all the restoration practices in the world. He reviews them in Africa and Asia and all sorts of places. Okay. But the two basic types are the Society for Ecological Restoration type, which says you repair the damage by removing the weeds, you replant, and then you let the ecosystem kind of go on its own trajectory. And the ecosystem eventually heals itself. And that's pretty much what we do in forest restoration in Seattle and in most places. And it works for forest restoration. The problem with it is that understory meadows, if they're treated like that, will succeed to shrub and then to trees. So your meadow's not going to last very long. However, if you restore the original relationships, and the original relationships that Native Americans had was regular burning, then you can maintain the meadow indefinitely. And so that's what we chose. And here's some examples of meadow restorations where things were allowed to just continue. This is at Cougar Mountain. It's the Red Town Meadow. As you can see, it's no longer a meadow at this point. This is Rocks Hill Park. That area was entirely planted in camas. There's no camas growing there at this time. It was planted around 2000 or 2001. And this is a meadow that was planted at the Duwamish Hills down in the flatland. That's the camas patch. Okay, so if you let it go and you don't keep cutting things down, you're not going to have a meadow for very long. And that's okay. Maybe you want it to succeed to something else. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that isn't what we wanted to do. We wanted to restore something that looked like a meadow. So our choice then was to restore traditional practices, and that meant recognizing that it's a disturbance ecosystem. It's a anti-climax ecosystem, if you will, or a disclimax ecosystem. You have to keep disturbing it, or the prairie or the meadow goes away. And that's really a sign of the kind of changes that First Peoples made to our ecosystem over the generations for the thousands of years that they were here. They disturbed areas in order to create certain ecotypes. And actually, you know, that's not that different from agricultural practices. We disturb systems in order to create cornfields. Now, I don't like those cornfields sometimes, but that's what we do, right? That's what humans do. It's not unusual. So they use fire to keep shrubs and conifers down. Well, guess what? We're not allowed to burn things in the park, but we do have steel tools, which is something they didn't have. So we can cut and we can remove, but that's not exactly the same as burning. And the question comes to mind, is that going to work? Well, we saw some evidence that it does. This is the last remnant of prairie in King County, which unfortunately has a house on it at this time. That blue stuff there is camas. The only maintenance that was done on that area for the 20 years before that picture was taken was mowing at the end of summer. That's it. Okay, yet the structure of the prairie remained. In fact, there were 6 prairie indicator species, Fritillaria phoenix, Viola adunca, Danthonia californica, help me, Shelley, Tritolea hyacinthina, Camasia quamash, and what was the other one? I did that one. Well, there's a 6th one. I'll buy a beer for anyone who can figure out what it was. And there were 14 other native species. Shelley and I also took a trip down to Eugene, Oregon to visit Ed Alverson, who's a great prairie fern forest, wonderful ecologist. And he took us around to Eugene, and we saw all these places that were only mowed at the end of summer. That's all that was done to them. And the reason they were only mowed at the end of the summer was because they were too wet during the summer to mow. And so parks didn't touch them, right? What happened? The bulbs were still living there. Even though the grass was thick, the bulbs were still coming up. The camas was coming up, the fritillaria was coming up, and there were several other bulbs that came up. So we had some indication that this would work. So we set out kind of goals for ourselves. What if we use the Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team, which is a great group of people up in on Vancouver Island that are doing wonderful work under Garry Oak Systems. And I have some reference material over there that lists how to get a hold of them. What if we use their ecotype for a dry oak woodland? And what if we planted camas bulbs? We heavily weighted other species. We would cut this thing down to the ground and remove everything. What would happen? Would it be maintainable over time? Would the habitat be healthy? What would the native food plants do? Would they do okay? In other words, could we maintain a meadow that way? So in the fall of 2012, when we started, the oak slope was completely covered with Seattle's most common association, which is the Blackberry Ivy Association. We couldn't plant there for a couple of years. We were going to have to first do some, removal, right? But Parks kindly let us put a patch of meadow underneath a couple of oak trees that were in the lawn. We sheet mulched it, or I should say we covered it with weed block. And actually, there's a few other things we did to the soil before we did that. We planted it in the fall of 2013, and the only thing we ever did to it was cut it by hand at the end of summer and remove everything. And we also removed the slash. And one of the reasons we removed the slash was because that prairie in Covington, they mowed, but they never removed anything. And as a result, there were about 3 or 4 inches of thick thatch on top of the soil that prevented anything from germinating. And it was a great place for voles. There were a lot of vole tunnels under it too. We actually might want the voles back at Martha Washington, but that's for another reason. How would that work? Well, this is what we planted. It's a great big long list of species. The red ones are the ones that died out. And unfortunately, in the red ones, most of those are the annuals who cannot keep the annuals going. And that's something I'll talk about more later. But we planted way too many species. We planted way too many of them, and we planted them too close together. And this is a common mistake that people are making in restorations. Okay? And I make it over and over and over again, even though I know I'm not supposed to do it. And the reason I do it is because you put that one little plant there and you put another one 10 feet away, and it doesn't look like you did anything. Right? But you did, because those two shrubs are eventually going to have a height of 15 feet and a diameter of 7 or 8, and they're going to overlap, even if you've planted them 10 or 12 feet away. So if you go in and you plant them every 3 feet away, you got a problem in a few years. You're going to have to take some things out. And guess what? The same thing is true with the small plants, except the distances are smaller. So really, when you're planting, figure out how many plants you think you need and divide that by 2, and keep dividing that by 2 for each person in your group, so that you get, 1/2 to the n, where that's the number of people in your group plants in the ground. And that might still be too many, but anyway, that's the approach you have to take. Anyway, we were able to plant this. There's another tip I want to show you here, though, if you ever try to do this. See this little flimsy, silly little fence in here? Parks put that up. Well, it's still there. What we did was we planted a hedge around it. The hedge protects the fence. The fence protects the plants from actually rabbits, because it was close enough together to do that, right? And dogs. And it looks much better than a fence, because the fence is about, 2.5 feet high, and the shrub is about 1/2 foot higher than that. So when you look at it, it looks like there's just a hedge, and it looks really nice. And even the people who really sort of violently object to fences often say, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll try that at our park. So consider it. This is on the left is what it looks like at the end of summer. There's a lot of thatch and whatnot there. On the right, you see what we've done. We have cleared everything away and we've scraped the ground. Okay, we've created bare ground. And there's one reason was to get annuals to germinate, but it had a better reason that showed up later. And then what does it look like after 10 years? Well, we still got a meadow. We're not getting succession because we cut everything down, right? We stop it. Up at the top, you can see the Camassia leeklinii, which is incredibly successful. This is Fritillaria finis over here, chocolate lily. This, by the way, the seed stock for this came from the prairie in Covington. This is Ulcinium douglasii, or grass widows. It's our first bloomer, followed very quickly by the Dodecatheon hendersonii, the shooting stars. And this is a delphinium. I think it's Delphinium trolleifolium. Lots of other plants, but I couldn't squeeze them all into the presentation. In 2015 and 16, we had enough cleared underneath the oaks to start planting there. And we started with camas patches. We planted Camassia leeklinii. We planted Camassia quamash. In 2016, Jeannie Scholmeiner, who was the district gardener, really got into this, and she helped us out in a big way. Her husband drove the brush mower for Parks, and so she finagled him to come over and cut down a big patch of blackberry for us. And after we cut down the blackberry, Green Seattle Partnership through Lisa Seco got us some really heavy-duty weed block. And we covered that whole area for a year and killed off almost all the blackberry. After we did that, we weeded it for another year, and then we planted this area. And this is a very interesting area because there's different soil types. It goes from hard clay to a sandy soil that's almost completely pure sand. And it goes from heavily shaded by the oak trees to full sun. So we had a lot of possibilities of planting things here. So how did we do overall? Well, the Camassia leeklinii is incredibly productive and spreading and beautiful. And frankly, I have to be honest, it's just the easiest darn plant there is to grow. You can throw seed on the ground, stomp it in with your feet. You can plant it in a tray, plant it when it's put in the ground when it's 1 year old. You can grow it into big bulbs and plant them. If you can't grow Camassia leeklinii, you need help. Okay, I mean, it's like not being able to grow crabgrass or something. But anyway, we're really happy with it. It got thick, and so we had to, quote unquote, harvest it and plant some of the bulbs in other places. At one point, we did have had few members of the Duwamish tribe come and exercise their treaty right to harvest in their traditional places. And I say that very carefully because there's a rule in parks that we cannot harvest things and we cannot share them. But again, that will come more into the presentation later. This is a chart of bloom times. So the species on the left and the months that they bloom in on the right. And you can see that we start very early with the Ulcinium douglasii. And even though it says February, I got to be honest, it's like the last week and a half in February, followed by the shooting stars, followed by the knick-knick. And actually the miner's lettuce gets in there pretty quick. And then our blooms, the number of blooms continue to increase through May and June. They start to drop off. And at the very end, we have our sedum blooming, and we have Achillea millefolium yarrow and Symphotrichium hollii, which is Hall's aster. Shooting stars on the right, Ulcinium on the left, and this is just kind of our earliest bloomers. We have penstemons blooming from late April to mid-August. The penstemon richardsonii is a really late bloomer, so it's a really nice one to have. And it blooms for a long time. It'll bloom for 2 or 3 months, as does the penstemon ovatus. The penstemon cardwellii over here is absolutely gorgeous, and the hummingbirds love it, but it lasts about 2 weeks, then it's done. But we love it anyway, and it makes a nice ground cover. Here's just a shot of that demonstration meadow garden. We've got some camas in there, some Aquilegia formosa, and some delphinium in that shot. There might be 1 or 2 other things there. And here's our late season bloomers. This is Hall's aster over here, a nice little white flower. It's a lot smaller than the Douglas aster, but again, it has the same range of pollinators that come to it. One of the things I have to say about it too is it's a threatened species. So if you do plant it, make sure, one, that you get real, honest to God, South Sound Symphotrichium hollii, okay, that you're not getting it from some nursery that crossed it with something else. And 2, don't plant any other asters near it because it will cross. You got to treat it as a special plant. And then, of course, there's the Achillea millefolium, and that's a very interesting plant. This is Clarkia purpurea. It's not grown very much around here, but it is native, and it turns out that the seeds are edible and were harvested by Native Americans. This is something that I didn't know until this year. We also have ground nesting bees, and there's the bee I was talking about. So we have here, and see this little bee in here? Very difficult to make out. Sorry, folks, but I was just pointing out the bee in the slide. That bee is the first bee that emerges in our area. It's a ground nesting bee, as are most of our native bees. And we have provided plenty of bare ground for the bees to nest in. One of the things we do in our restorations, and I have done it, so I confess to that, is we use way too much mulch, way too thick, and in too many places. If we cover the ground with mulch, the ground nesting bees have nowhere to go. The Garry Oak Ecosystem Recovery Team recommends 30% bare ground in your restoration for the ground nesting bees. Now, take a look at your restorations, and I don't think any of us come up to that. We're getting close to that at Martha Washington, and we're going to try to go to 40, because at least under the oaks, to do that. So we've been successful. And then, of course, we have someone who has been taking pictures of the insects at our park. And he says that he's never seen so many insects and bugs in a restoration site before. And that's probably because of all the forbs and flowers we have. We'll see what he comes up with this spring. He's been doing it in summer when the insect count is actually down a little bit. Food plants are doing well. This is Camassia quamash up here, Camassia leeklinii. You can see why this one is called common and this one is called great. This up here is a very edible little corm, Dichelostemma congesta, or, whoops, wrong way, back, okay. Dichelostemma congesta, or ukau is its common name. It's edible raw. Unlike camas, you really don't have to cook it. It kind of tastes like water chestnuts without nearly as much flavor as a water chestnut, which has no flavor as far as I can tell. But roasted, I'll tell you, roasted with a little garlic, a little olive oil, a little salt, a little pepper, maybe some butter, tastes really good. Of course, if you roasted newspaper that way, it would taste good too. But anyway, and then we have some fritillaria bulbs here. We also have Tritolea hyacinthina, which is called fool's onion, and Brodia coronaria, which has the imaginative name harvest Brodia. Those are also coming along, but we don't have enough of them at this point to consider them harvestable. They're a lot harder to grow. We also have Clarkias growing, and we're going to look at how one would harvest those seeds. And of course, we have miner's lettuce, lots of miner's lettuce, which is a great winter green. Annuals, well, we're not doing so good on annuals. I have to say that. We have some that are growing okay, but all the annuals in the demo garden died off, despite raking the ground. We have some sandy soil that we planted later. The Plectritis congesta, common name is sea blush. What's the common name of that? Sea blush, yeah. And the Clarkia purpurea and Clarkia amoena are doing well. The Claytonia perfoliata, the miner's lettuce, is actually too aggressive, but again, it's an annual. It's there. So we're looking at how to improve those annuals, and I'll talk a little more about that later. We're getting oak regeneration. At first, we were planting acorns, but then the Squirrel Union went on strike and said, we're doing that, not you. And we get 15 to 35 new oak seedlings a year. This year, we may get close to 100 because it's a mast year. And I think I have time to tell you this story. I think I do. Last year, there were almost no acorns on any trees between British Columbia and Northern California. Nobody had acorns. This year, every tree practically from Northern California to British Columbia is covered with acorns. It's a mast year. So the acorns, we think, we don't actually know what they think, but we think that they do this to knock down predators. So in one year, they have kind of a starvation year for their predators, right? Like the oak moth, the oak acorn moth, right? And then in the next year, they hit it with acorns so that some of them will get into the ground and grow. What we don't know is what social media app they're using to communicate and do it all at the same time, okay? A social media app, by the way, that's existed for 1 million years. Our current problems and projects, we are very lucky to have problems. And I say we're lucky because that's how you learn. When you have problems, you have something to research, you have something to discuss, you have something to have arguments over on what to do about it, and you have things you can try and things you can learn from. And the problems we have, actually, I can look at it there, but it's easier for me to look at it here. We have aggressive native plants. We have a few of them that just take over their area and don't let anything else grow. We have these mixed plantings where we put a whole bunch of seeds or bulbs in one spot. And to care for one bulb, you have to disturb another bulb. Okay, it just doesn't quite work right. Okay, and the same thing is true about some of the annuals. To harvest the one annual, you've got to get in there and disturb the other annual. We also have soils that are not getting improved. When you cut the organic matter and remove it, you're not adding anything to the soil. And I think getting back to the annuals, some of them take over and some of them die out. And what we're discovering is that the key to solving this problem is to think of this not as a restoration that we leave alone or that we tend, but a restoration that we harvest from. These are plants that were harvested by Native Americans, and the action that they took made the ecosystem work. And by the way, I need to interject something here. I'm using the past tense about what the ancestors did. I don't know how to talk about the past without using the past tense. But I'm not trying to imply that Native Americans are not still here and not still active. Many tribes, the Snoqualmie tribe, the Nisqually tribe, even the Duwamish who don't have any money are doing things to restore our land. Okay, they're still active. They're still here. They're still part of our community, and they're still fighting to save this earth. Let's go through these. Miner's lettuce. As you can see, there's nothing there but miner's lettuce. And that's what it looks like if you let it grow. Well, what were we doing? We were letting everything grow until summer, and then we cut it down. Well, by summer, the miner's lettuce all dried up. All the seeds have dropped. If we see this as lettuce, which it is, okay, and we harvest it, which we're not supposed to do. And so officially, we harvest these things and we use them as mulch. Okay, nobody takes miner's lettuce home to eat it in our park. If we harvest it at the right time, then what we're doing is we're removing all the seeds, because actually we're either harvesting it before or after it flowers, okay? And not only that, but we're harvesting it when we most need fresh greens, in the middle of winter, early spring. So seeing it as a food plant and treating it at a food plant is the way to do it. And of course, we'll leave enough for regeneration, but we're not going to let all those plants go to seed, because they'll choke themselves out after a while. Ucal. That's what it looks like if you let Diclostema congesta go on its own. It takes over. It's smothering. It smothered some fritillaria in that area. It's smothered some small Camasia quamash, and it's smothering some wild strawberry right there that actually came from the prairie in Covington also. So again, this is a plant where you have to have a little bit of knowledge of how it works. We tried in 2018 actually to get rid of it in a 10 square foot area. 2 people worked for 3 hours on that 10-foot square area. They removed every single Diclostema bulb and offset they could find. In 2018, there was more Diclostema than when they started. Okay, it's kind of like trying to get rid of yarrow, you know. Anyway. So what did we learn about this plant? Well, notice these little things sticking out on the end of this corm here. Those are offsets. One of these plants can produce 8, 10 offsets. It turns out if you pull this plant out of the ground in the summer, the offsets fall off into the ground. And they're tiny, right? You can't possibly find them all. There's no way you can screen them to get them out, right? But if you pull this plant out of the ground while it's still in bloom or just after it's finished blooming, the offsets are stuck tightly to the corm. So if you harvest it at the right time, you're going to reduce the population, because you're going to harvest it before the seed set, and you're going to take all of those offsets out with you when you do it. So we're implementing this in some of the areas where we have Diclostema congesta. So the harvest timing is affecting the population density. Now, I also remember hearing many things from Native Americans say, we always harvest the camas in bloom. And I think actually that relates to this, because if you wait to harvest the camas when it's dropped seed, you get too much camas seed in the ground too. But if you harvest the plants that are the biggest, which are the ones you want to harvest, they've been blooming for 2 or 3 years. You take those out of the ground before they drop their seed, and then you let some of the other plants produce seed. That may be what harvesting while it's in bloom is about. One of the things we're seeing is as we harvest, we're not improving the ground. A member of the Duwamish Tribal Council was at the park a couple of months ago. We were digging camas, and she said, "Oh, no, don't do it that way. My grandmother said, when you dig up the bulb, fold up the stalk and put it in the ground where the bulb was." And I'm going, well, duh. Why didn't I think of that? We're going to be implementing that. It may be enough to improve the soils that we've got, or it may take a long time. We don't know, but we're going to try it and track it and see how it goes. Okay. Again, it's not only the knowledge of we're going to harvest this. It's not only the idea of cutting at the end of the season, but it's intimate knowledge of your soil, what you have to do to take care of the soil, and knowing that what you're doing is going to affect the land 6, 7, 8 years from now, or maybe even 7 generations from now. Annuals. This is an interesting picture over here on the right of Cecilia Joaquin of the Hopland Pomo. It's an Edwin Curtis picture that's in the book Tending the Wild by M. Cat Anderson. It shows her harvesting seeds from some annual plant. I don't know what it is. And the way it was done was you had a basket and a beater. Okay. You got most of the seeds in the basket, but you got to bet that some of the seeds hit the ground. Annuals were harvested. Annuals were tended. In fact, not only were they harvested, but they grew them in patches, single species patches. There were travelers that went through this is from California, went through California and saw acres of the same annual species growing solidly just that. Native American elders told Cat Anderson, we do that because it makes it easier to harvest. I think it also makes it easier to control the regeneration of the plant. But anyway, the elders also told her that they would harvest, then burn, then they would harrow. Okay. For those of you who don't know, harrow is dragging the ground to create roughness on the ground. A lot of harrowing tools that were used were just a big heavy board with nails sticking out of it, and that they dragged that. And after harrowing, then they would scatter the seeds. So we're going to look at some of our annuals that way and say, well, let's consider this as a food plant. Let's harvest it. We'll cut it and remove it because we can't burn, and then we'll harrow the ground, and then we'll take some of that seed that we harvested and we'll reseed it, and we'll compare that to some of the other areas and see how they do. Right? Again, this is not just cutting things down. It's not just burning, but incorporating the whole cycle of what you do with this plant into our work. So I've talked about adding harvesting to the project of Martha Washington. But there's a project that was started in 2016 with the express intention of harvesting native plants. This is the Native Guilds project at the Beacon Food Forest. I started it in 2016, but in 2021, the leadership passed to an energetic, brilliant group of what I'm old enough to call young people, which is led by Antonio Flores, who's going to continue the presentation by describing some of the things that are going on there. I would very much love to tell you all the wonderful things I know about Antonio, but he's asked to introduce himself. So let's please welcome Antonio.
Let me just get situated here. Thank you, David. So I am Antonio Flores, and I come from an indigenous group known as the Genízaro. We are the descendants of indigenous slaves that were integrated into the Hispanic culture of New Mexico. And as such, my ancestry is mixed between many tribes. There's Pecos Pueblo, Mescalero Apache, Navajo, and Comanche. And I actually mostly grew up in Southern California, away from my communities in New Mexico. But I would frequently go visit the small farming village where my dad grew up. And it was there that I built a connection, a relationship, an understanding, and an existence with the Pinon juniper woodlands, where my ancestors had long lived before me. And so it was instilled in me from a young age that I had a distinct connection with the land, and I learned about my community's practices and traditions where we made use of what the land provided. We made sure to support and give back to the land as it had provided for us, and this paved the way for me to pursue a career in conservation and to focus many of my studies on ethnobotany. So I studied at Western Washington University. I earned an environmental science degree, and that led to me becoming a habitat restoration practitioner. I started with Washington Conservation Corps. I have worked at restoration sites all over the Puget Sound, and eventually this led to me working for the Snoqualmie tribe. And while I'm proud of my professional work, I'm here to talk about my volunteering projects, namely my work as a lead volunteer at the Beacon Food Forest. And some more about the Beacon Food Forest. It was started 11 years ago, and it started as a permaculture community garden with the concept of being an open harvest for all. And it's located on public land that's owned by Seattle Public Utilities, and it currently occupies 3 acres with the potential to expand up to 7 acres. And at the core of the food forest is the idea of food sovereignty. And so food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. And it's also about their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. Another core tenet of the food forest is permaculture. And this is a system of land management that adopts arrangements observed in natural ecosystems. And so plant communities are grown together in guilds where they complement one another and function as a larger system. And I mean, an important thing to acknowledge is these concepts aren't anything new, and they largely follow practices of indigenous forms of agriculture. And so I'm a steward at the Native Guild. It's a smaller section of the Beacon Food Forest. It occupies roughly a fifth of an acre. And it's where we're growing plants in a variety of ecotypes. We have a pine forest, we have a fen wetland, and of course we have our meadow. And that is a meadow with a gradient from wet meadow all the way to dry meadow. So there's a lot of hydrology, a lot of interesting niches, edge habitats that we get to work with there. And another thing is it's an actively growing and evolving landscape. So the Native Guild has expanded as we've planted, or as it's expanded, we planted edible hedgerows. As David talked about earlier, they're really great for blocking out weeds. And we've also thinned out willows that have shaded out our wapato pools, and we've thinned rushes that have been crowding out our camas patches. And so we call it a native plant garden, but what is a native plant? Are we talking about plants native to Beacon Hill, to Seattle, to the Puget Sound lowlands, or do we mean plants that are from west of the Cascades or native to Washington State? And so we also have to ask ourselves, is it a native plant from what time period? Since ecosystem change, it's kind of a fluid way to think about plants. And so in the Native Guild, we add and we remove plants constantly, and that is with intention. We add plants to the garden, and the way that we decide on that is if there's just some way to justify it. Are we creating beneficial plants for pollinators, like the native bumblebee here? Are we providing food for that native pollinator? Or do we want to plant more plants for the sake of biodiversity? Or perhaps we want to perform experiments. Maybe we want to plant something non-native, like the incense cedar, and then think about assisted migration. And so another way that we can justify these plants are if we plant first foods. And so first foods are plants that were cultivated and wild harvested by native people before contact with Europeans. In this region, we have a lot of first foods, and they're no longer the traditional food staples that they once were. And that's because of colonization and the change from indigenous land management. And first foods, they cover a diverse bounty of food species. The Coast Salish are known to have, they eat food from over 300 species, primarily before European contact. And that's opposed to the standard American diet, which is dominated by just a handful of species such as wheat, beef, corn, and tomatoes. So this is, and that's reflected in the way that industrial agriculture promotes growing crops in monocultures instead of recognizing the abundance of cultivating a biodiverse habitat. And so the Native Guild presents an opportunity where folks can learn about these diverse first foods through experiential learning and by getting their hands dirty. It's a place where people can learn about reciprocity with the land. We're understanding that if we take care of their native plant relatives, they will take care of us and sustain us. So the picture on the bottom left, that's from our most recent camas harvest that happened about 2 months ago. So David first planted camas there in 2016, and it's now established well enough that we think that it's fine to harvest that camas. And that's after countless work parties where we have provided for the camas, weeding out competing plants, and now we're able to harvest from them. And so we harvested, and then I cooked it at home in a crock pot. And so that's the picture in the middle. We got a nice camas bounty. And then the picture on the right are the soap berries, and we've harvested that the past 2 years and made a nice treat called Indian ice cream. And so another important first food that we're growing is wapato. So wapato, it's a traditional first food. There's archaeological evidence of cultivation here in the Pacific Northwest, going back all the way 3,800 years ago. And its ideal habitat is stagnant or slow-moving water. And that was much more common before we channelized our rivers and before we drained our remnant oxbow lakes. And the few places where wapato is now found, it cannot be harvested safely because of bioaccumulation of toxins. So we have a unique opportunity here with the Native Guild. We actually have a year-round spring, and that allows for water to pool, and it forms a fen wetland. And here we've planted Wapato to take advantage of that. And from my experience working with Wapato, if it's grown in tubs of water, they reproduce very quickly. They tend to get crowded, and they're going to need regular thinning for overall plant health. So here you can see on the bottom right, we harvest the Wapato. And so when we harvest, we loosen up the soil, the tubers, we remove competing weeds, and we reform the pools where water can collect and continue the Wapato cultivation indefinitely. And so, in fact, this past year, we've harvested our Wapato pools and we've expanded them. We've expanded them about threefold, and we're going to actually be harvesting them pretty soon, towards the end of this month. And then another first food is the ozette potato. And so it's another first food that that indigenous people have have cultivated. It was introduced here in the Pacific Northwest in 1791. It was actually brought by Spanish at a short-lived colony at Nia Bay. And of course, it's from South America, and it likely made its way through Mexico to Nia Bay. And it was first adopted by the Makah tribe, and from there it spread preceding European contact to other tribes. It spread like wildfire. And so European traders with the Hudson's Bay Company, they have notes about first encountering tribes in the 1820s, and they actually purchased potatoes from them. So it's been here for a while and was readily cultivated by indigenous groups and traded in vast trade networks. And these potatoes are very productive and sought after crops. And in many cases, potato patches, they replaced or they supplemented camas patches. And so the ozette potato, it's an heirloom variety, and it's persisted hundreds of years due to continuous cultivation by the Makah tribal community. And there's been a revival in the ozette potato since the 1980s, with people becoming more interested in sustainable, local, and organic foods. And we're actually having an ozette potato harvest this weekend. On Saturday, we'll be harvesting 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. So let me know if you're interested. And so in addition to food, we also grow plants for materials. Two species that we're focusing on establishing right now are the chairmaker's rush and beargrass. And another plant that has gotten consistent harvesting are the tule, which we've harvested the past 4 years. We recently had a tule mat making workshop this past winter. And so these events are free. They're open to any volunteers that want to get together, hang out, have fun crafting with these native plants. And another plant, of course, we have willows. We have too many willows. And so the willows, they've adapted to beavers and other herbivores. And so we're helping to maintain that with consistent thinning. And we've crafted great materials in the process. So the top right picture, that's a tiny fence around our nursery. We need the fence to protect our baby plants from eastern cottontail rabbits. So we thank the willows for harvesting from them, and we're able to craft a nice fence for that and protect all our other plants. And in the past, there's also been basket weaving, and that's something we can try out in the future too. And so looking ahead, the garden, it's ultimately a reflection of the community, and it can be whatever we want it to be. And so we're looking at ways to get volunteers more involved in documenting the Native Guild, primarily through citizen science opportunities. So this year we marked out photo points around the Native Guild to help document how the garden changes over time. And we have an iNaturalist project to help volunteers make observation and take note of all the biodiversity found at the food forest. And in addition to these efforts, we also have a wetland right there. And so there's a lot of potential for water quality monitoring and for volunteers to get involved with helping with the wetland. And so we're also just focused on growing more productive food plants. Like I mentioned, there's the ozette potato and also nodding onion. These are plants that I've noticed they just produce a bounty, and so it's very productive. And it's a great way to feed more people and get them thinking more about native plants as food. And we're also just interested in collaborating more with indigenous groups and community. Food sovereignty and interest in traditional foods, they're making a resurgence right now in Indian country, and the Native Guild is a unique space that can support that. And it'd just be great for Indigenous folks to connect more to their traditional first foods here at the Native Guild. And we're also focused on continuing to build community. The food forest, it's a place where I've gotten to know my neighbors, and strangers have become good friends. And so while many volunteers are locals of Beacon Hill, we also have many that come from North Seattle and elsewhere. And that's because there just really aren't many places like it. And so I think we can meet more community and ecological needs by having more food forest and replicating this beyond just the Native Guild or Martha Washington Park. And so they'd be great spaces for people to support native habitat, grow food, and get to know their neighbors in the process. And that's my talk. Back to David.
Thank you, Antonio. Okay, so one of the things I want to say about the food forest is the project's been going on for 8 years. And most restoration projects, you know, I mean, I've been involved in a lot of them now. They kind of peak in involvement around 2 or 3 years when it's planting time. I mean, if you go to another area that might, you know, your area keeps increasing, that might change, right? And then it kind of levels off or maybe even declines. I think the Food Forest Native Guilds project is just reaching stride, actually. And I think it will continue growing and continue growing for years because of the things that are done there, because of the, oh, I guess I need my glasses here. What was I going to say? Yeah, it'll continue to grow because of the harvest and use, because of the cultural connections, and because of the continuing education and the opportunity for experimentation and learning that goes on there. I'm going to end our talk about using things with a quote from Cat Anderson's book. Cat Anderson started in the 60s, I think, going around interviewing elders from various tribes in California. Most of those elders have passed on, but she published a book called Tending the Wild, which has many, many recollections and lots of information about Native American agriculture in California. It also has some history of the genocide that occurred. So when you pick up that book, be prepared. It's a really important book to read, and I recommend it to everybody that wants to understand, you know, what went on and what was done. But anyway, I want to read that out loud. Several important insights were revealed to me as I talked with elders and accompanied them on plant gathering walks. The first of these was that one gains respect for nature by using it judiciously. By using a plant or an animal, interacting with it where it lives, and tying your well-being to its existence, you can be intimate with it and understand it. The elders challenged the notion I had grown up with, that one should respect nature by leaving it alone, by showing me that we learn respect through the demands put on us by the great responsibility of using a plant or animal. It's very different from what I was taught when I started doing restoration. And I think it's a challenging thought for us to think about how we can use that concept in our restorations without getting in trouble by doing too much. Anyway, clicker, clicker, clicker. Okay. I also need to make a distinction between use and foraging. Now, I know that many foragers are very responsible, and that people who don't have access to a native plant garden go out and forage because it's the only way they can get some of these native plants to use. And they do learn a lot by using the native plants, and it's very educational. But there's a difference between restoration separated from foraging and agriculture. We're talking about agriculture. When you do restoration and you plant and you tend and it grows and you just kind of let it go on its way, and then somebody comes in and forages, you don't have the connection. But if you're doing agriculture, you plant, you tend, you harvest, you feed back into your planting and your tending. It's a loop. You become part of the loop. I think that's actually the tradition that's in many, it's in everybody's history somewhere. In everybody's history somewhere, there was somebody who lived on the land. You might have to go back a long way. You might not be able to find it. In my case, it was my grandparents, so I know what they did. All four of them came from the peasantry in northern Italy. they didn't teach us any of these things because they were taught that what they did was beneath dignity. It was undignified. They wanted their children to grow up to become Americans, rich Americans particularly, which none of us did, unfortunately. But I was able to connect back through music, through writings, through studying the festivals, the cycle of festivals in those areas that begin in winter and go all the way through the year and come back, and that connect people with things that are going on in the land at the time of the festival. Okay. And also some writings of people who in Piemonte, where some of my ancestors came from, were trying to go back and resurrect those traditions and figure out how they could connect with them in the context of an industrial world. So I know that my people had this kind of connection to the land, and I believe everybody did. And I believe that if we can rebuild that kind of connection with the land through the kinds of projects that Antonio and I are working on, and the projects that you all are working on, we can actually heal ourselves to a certain extent and break down that artificial barrier between us and nature and realize that actually Homo sapiens is a species that's part of this world. We are part of nature. We're actually a keystone species. You may not like what we do, but we are a keystone species. So there's a big gotcha in this at Martha Washington Park. At the food forest, which is run by SPU, you can see that all of these things that you want to do for agriculture over here, harvesting, using power tools, removing, replanting, tilling, fertilizing, permanent fencing, they're all allowed or inherent or encouraged. In the park, however, you're not allowed to eat anything that you dig up. You're not allowed to use power tools. You're discouraged from removing and replanting. You're discouraged from tilling and fertilizing, and you're not allowed to put up permanent fencing without a planning process that will go on longer than you can live. In fact, all of you, I want you to learn not ever to say two words in your park. One of them is sign, and the other is trail. Okay, both of them require planning processes. However, a temporary posting does not require any planning pause. There's only one person who approves it. We put up a temporary posting in 2013. It's still there. So this is a problem. Now, to be fair, Parks is looking at this. The plant ecologists do not like this. Well, I don't know if they like it or not, but they realize that it's a problem for places like Martha Washington Park, the Daystar Project at Discovery, okay, and other projects where people are getting into this idea of use and caring for the land in the way that we're doing it. And they're looking at ways to make this work. It's not trivial for them. One of the problems they have is if they were to open up harvest in the parks, there are people who would literally come and take everything. Okay, that happens. Okay, even at the food forest, I know someone at the food forest who has been cultivating quinces for years, and for years she was complaining that she never gets any because somebody comes and harvests them all. So, there are most people are pretty good about it, but there are a few people that will, take everything. So they need to have strict rules about that. Next, we're almost done here. So if you want to do something like this, here are some tips. First of all, start small. Remember that you're going to be maintaining this area for years. So start small. Figure, even if it's 10 by 10, that's plenty. You can do a lot in that. As I've said before, and I'll say again, plant fewer plants than you think you need. Plant fewer species than you think you need. This is something actually I learned from Stuart Weschler, who has advocated rather than planting a whole bunch of plants, you plant one of something and let it spread itself. And we've actually done that to some extent very successfully. Well, in an area like this, we might plant 5 of something, okay? But, his idea of planting a few and letting them spread, I think is very good ecology, very good way to look at things. Choose an area with relatively few surrounding weeds, like back it up against the rest of your restoration, because you're going to be weeding around it and keeping the weeds from coming in. As I said, plan on the continued maintenance. As much as possible, propagate what you need. This is important for a couple reasons. First of all, you really become intimate with the plant when you propagate it. Okay, that's how you're really going to learn these plants that way. And learn what they need, how they grow. It's like, starting with an infant and watching it grow into an adult. You really learn about that person, right? Secondly, you're going to get the plants when you need them. Green Seattle Partnership is wonderful. They provide tons of plants for us, but they all come in November, right? Sometimes you need the bulb earlier than that, Well, if you're growing it yourself, you have it, right? And the third reason is that the Green Seattle Partnership gets these plants from wholesalers, and the wholesalers don't always know what they're giving you. And so sometimes mistakes filter through the system. We got a whole bunch of what was supposed to be Romer's fescue that turned out to be Dischampsia cespitosa, a wetland grass. And there's no way that the people at Green Seattle Partnership could have known this because they were tiny plugs. And believe me, it's really hard to identify a grass if it's not blooming. And put the garden where people can see it. It's going to be beautiful. Put the low fence and the hedge around it. It's going to be awesome. I've printed these resources out here if anybody wants them. My email is there. Antonio's email is there. If you want to contact us about anything, we'll help you to the best of our ability. And then I want to extend my thanks to everyone who's helped at the food forest, to Antonio for his leadership of the native guilds and everybody that's working there. In fact, there are a few people over there from the food forest, and there's Rob back there who is, I guess, partly the engineer of the Wapato beds at one point, okay, and still is, and the trails, right, okay, and to Maddie and Yvonne over there who are great volunteers at the food forest as well. So thank you all for everything you do. And I want to also extend thanks to all the GSP ecologists who have bent over backwards to help us. Their hands are tied sometimes, but they've done everything they possibly can to help us at Martha Washington Park and the Seattle Parks and Recreation gardeners as well. Other than that, I'm done. So thank you for being patient and listening. I guess we take questions now, or what happens? The floor was open for questions, but since they weren't recorded, I'll repeat them. The first question asked us if we water. In general, we only water plants to establish them. And once they're established, they're on their own. There's a couple of exceptions, but not many. We are doing a native garden, so they should be adapted to our water regime. One trick that I use, which is an African technique, is a watering tube. If you're watering plants on a hill, you don't want to be carrying buckets of water up the hill all day, right? And you want the water to go down to the roots. So what we do is we dig the hole for the plant. This works for shrubs, okay? Dig the hole for the plant, and we put a PVC tube or whatever plastic we can get our hands on tube down to the bottom where the roots are. We throw a few chips in there to keep it from evaporating, and then we put the water in the tube. Okay, if you try to water deep by watering the top of the plant, you're going to need a lot of water. But if you try to water deep through these tubes, and we usually use 1.5 to 2 inch diameter tubes, you're just going to save your back climbing up the hill. Okay, and it's going to be very effective. Okay? But all the plants we plant, especially the bulbs, adapt immediately. We don't water the bulbs ever. Okay.
Yeah, similar answer here. They're native plants. I don't think we really need to water them. And so it's funny, actually, Rob in the audience, he's the chief waterer as well as the Wapato engineer and the trails guy. And yeah, I'm eternally grateful. But one thing we've noticed is that some of the plants, we've watered them to establish them, but now even years later, they still need water. So there's things that we're considering, like the fact that the climate is changing. We're having longer droughts in the summer. And so we're trying to adapt to that and just thinking about maybe transplanting the plants, moving them to a better site, putting them where there's more shade. But ultimately, we don't really want to water the plants. And luckily, the Wapato, they need water, but there's a spring to provide that year round.
What do you do with all the oaks that sprout? Unfortunately, they don't transplant well. Okay, they really don't. If you dig an oak if you put an oak in a pot, you can usually transplant it for a year or two, and even longer in some cases. But when you dig them out of the ground, it's very damaging to them because even after a year, they're going to have a root like that. What we do is we let them grow for a few years, and then we select the ones that are in the best locations and the most vigorous, and we do cull the rest. There's really nothing else we can do. Otherwise, we'd have, oaks 2 feet apart in a very short time. There were 9 at Martha Washington when we started, and Parks planted 6, and we planted 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We planted 15 that were tending, and then there's another 5 or 6 that were planted by squirrels that we're letting grow. Okay, but these are all very small trees at this point. At Seward Park, Parks planted close to 80 oak trees about 8 or 9 years ago. And then there was another planting of something like 15 trees that was done 20, 25 years ago. And those didn't show up on my map. I don't consider those historic trees. Have you planted madrones? We're talking about planting madrones at Martha Washington. We now, I think, have enough cleared space where we can do that. There's some debate in the community about whether it's better to plant them from seed or from starts. And I'm trying to get some inputs from people. If anybody here has any experience in planting madrones, I'd love to talk to you. Where could one get acorns to plant? This year you will find it very easy to find Garry oak acorns. They're ripening on the trees right now. There are a lot of them that are falling at Martha Washington Park and probably at Seward. I don't mind sharing those acorns, and I think we could certainly get away with it even with the park rules. If somebody wanted to contact me, I could certainly direct that person to sources of oaks. As far as the spacing, well, a lot of that depends on your time frame and what you want. Some people plant oaks fairly close together, 10 or 15 feet apart, and they get a nice interconnected canopy out of that. Okay, that can be nice. Other people feel like you should plant oaks, 100 feet apart, so that 300 years from now you'll have a tree with a 75-foot diameter radius of its canopy. I think you have to look at your situation and what you want to achieve in terms of how far apart you want to plant them. Okay? You also have to recognize you're going to have some mortality. Whether you plant plants that you grew in a pot for a while, or plants acorns that you put in the ground. When we plant from acorns, we usually put 3 or 4 in the ground at the same spot. Okay? Just because of the mortality, and we let them grow for 4 or 5 years before we take one of them out. What nutrients go into the soil after a burn? That's a good question. I'm going to be really honest and say I don't have a really good answer to what those nutrients are. But we have considered adding ash from low-intensity fires. At one point, I actually tried taking some of the slash home and trying to burn it at low intensity and then taking that back to the park. And it wasn't a particularly dangerous or scary experience, but it wasn't very successful. I think it would be good to get that kind of nutrient back in. I think what you're going to find is that the potassium's still there, and the phosphorus is probably still there, and the nitrogen is gone. That would be my understanding of the chemistry of what happens when you burn something. And then any minerals that happen to be in any heavier minerals that happen to be in the plant are still there. The other thing is that those burns are low in prairies are low intensity, so they really more singe the plants than really toast them. The problem I had in my little incinerator was things got too hot. I have been able to make this work in my front yard, though. What I do is I wait until it's raining, and then I go out with a torch and I torch it a little bit, and it works pretty well. The Romer's fescue loves that, by the way. And there's some other plants that just go, yeah, we got burned, and they grow really fantastically. That's exciting, burning plant. But yeah, that it works. I think that's something we need to look into, and that gives me actually a good segue into one thing, which is we got a lot of room for people to try things and learn things at Martha Washington and the food forest. And anybody who's interested in doing some projects like learning how to better grow annuals or learning how to apply ash and what the nutrients are, or something like that, let me know. The questioner pointed out that prairie fires are often low oxygen fires, which is one of the ways that you get biochar. And then asked a question about weed block and what effect that might have on the roots of the oak tree. Do you have a comment on that? If you don't, I'll just go ahead. Okay. So I've heard exactly the same thing about the burning. Okay. And that's one of the reasons I basically too much oxygen in my incinerator. Okay. But as far as using the weed block, okay, if we go back to that first picture, we use it in a very small area around the tree. We got to remember that this oak tree, if the oak tree has a diameter of 25 feet, its root system is 3 times that diameter. Okay, so we covered a small portion of its roots. Okay, and effectively the same thing when we weed block the other area. Okay, I would be very reluctant to weed block a more significant portion of a tree's roots, which is exactly what's being done with all of the apartments that are being built in Seattle. Okay, if you look at those trees, oh yay, we saved the tree. It's in the parking strip, you know, there, and it's got an area for its roots about this big, and then the house is over here and the road is over there, and I don't know what that tree is going to look like in 10 years. Okay. But there are also weed blocks that pass oxygen. Okay, and I'll be less reluctant to try those. Okay, the one that we use, what we did in the demo garden, well, first of all, with the blackberries, we were just brutal with it. Okay, but in the demo garden, what we did was we put a layer of oak leaves down, and then we put some cardboard on top of that, and then we put a weed block on it that was more of a light shade block than an oxygen depriver. So the basic thing that deprived oxygen was the cardboard. And we only had it down for 1 year, again, in a small area. But it's a good question. I'm very sensitive to that. Our trees get a lot of attention above ground, but they don't get enough attention under the ground. And that's where everything's going on. That's another thing about propagation. You get to know the roots of the plant, which you don't do in a lot of situations. Yanka. What is the best time to collect acorns? In the next 3 weeks. They're going to, in our area. Now that's going to vary from area to area and tree to tree, but I'm seeing them drop now. And they should be immediately planted, by the way. Acorns are a plant that has seed that has no dormancy whatsoever. As soon as it hits the ground, hits moisture and warmth, it's going to start generating the root.
I'll also add that you might want to harvest them a couple weeks later. They have the weevil pest, and stories I've heard is you might want to wait for a later drop before harvesting the first initial ones. Yeah, the weevil pest is a real problem. One of the things you want to do with your acorns when you collect them is put them in a tub of water. If they sink, they're good. If they don't sink, toss them. They're not going to germinate because the inside of them has been eaten out. Also, one of the things we do when we're collecting acorns is we put bags over the acorns. Cloth bags, or those bags that they have at PCC for putting your vegetables in, and we tie that down, and that keeps the acorn moth away.